Boy asked, "Can I borrow a helmet for my mom?" The bikers were stunned to hear that. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The sound of roaring engines filled the empty highway as Jake Thunder Morrison, a rugged Hells Angels biker, sped down the desolate road. His Harley-Davidson growled beneath him, the cold wind slicing through the air. It was a usual ride, peaceful, isolated, the kind he had grown used to over the years. But today, something was different. Out of nowhere, a small figure darted into the road, causing Jake to slam on his brakes. His eyes narrowed as he saw a young boy, no more than 10 years old, standing in front of him. "Hey, are you okay?" Jake called out, his voice gruff but laced with concern. The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with desperation. He was shaking, his clothes ragged, and the cold was starting to take its toll. "Mister, can I borrow a helmet for my mom?" The words hit Jake like a punch in the gut. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "What did you say?" The boy stepped forward, his hands trembling as he clutched his jacket tighter against the biting wind. "Can I borrow a helmet for my mom? She's really sick, and I just need to get her to the hospital, but I don't have anything to protect her." Jake's mind raced. 1,000 questions flooded his thoughts. Why didn't he have a helmet for her? Why was he out here alone, in such a dangerous situation? The boy's face was filled with fear, but there was also something else, hope. Hope that a stranger like Jake might be able to help him, even in a world where most people turned a blind eye. For a moment, Jake felt his tough exterior begin to crack. He had seen a lot in his years as a biker, but nothing had quite hit him like this. This was a child, desperate for help, and there was no way he could turn him away. Without a word, Jake dismounted from his bike and walked over to the boy. He reached into his bag and pulled out a spare helmet. "Here," Jake said, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze. "This will help. Where's your mom?" The boy's eyes lit up with gratitude, but the fear never fully left his expression. "She's just down the street. I need to hurry." "Thank you." Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but one thing was clear. He couldn't leave the boy alone in this situation. With a sigh, Jake climbed back onto his Harley and motioned for the boy to follow. They rode together, the wind whipping around them as they sped down the road, the helmet securely in place on the boy's head. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he kept his eyes on the road ahead. What he didn't know was that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. Stay tuned to see what happens next. As Jake and Billy sped down the empty highway, the wind howled around them, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. The boy clutched the helmet tightly in his hands, his small knuckles white from the pressure. Jake's eyes stayed focused on the road, but his mind was racing. The boy's situation seemed desperate, and the look in his eyes told Jake that this wasn't just a simple favor. There was something more, something deeper. Jake had seen a lot of things in his years on the road, but nothing quite like this. He could tell Billy wasn't just some kid asking for help. There was fear in his eyes, but also something else, a quiet strength. As they approached the small, dilapidated house where Billy had told him his mother was, Jake's gut twisted. The house was run down, its paint chipped, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. It looked like no one had taken care of it for years. Billy hopped off the bike as soon as they stopped and ran towards the house, the helmet still clutched in his hands. Jake followed slowly, the weight of what was about to happen sinking in. The door creaked as Billy pushed it open, and Jake's eyes scanned the inside. The place was dark, the curtains drawn tight against the midday sun. It smelled of stale air and something else, something that made Jake's stomach churn. As they stepped inside, Billy called out, "Mom? Mom, I brought help." There was no answer at first. Then, from the back of the house, a faint voice replied, "Billy? Is that you?" The voice sounded weak, fragile. Billy's face lit up with relief, and he ran towards the back room. Jake followed, but his steps were slower, cautious. The room was dimly lit, and in the corner, lying on a worn-out couch, was a woman. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled. She looked exhausted, barely conscious. Jake's heart tightened at the sight of her. This was no ordinary situation. He had seen people in bad shape before, but there was something about this woman that made his chest ache. Billy reached her side and gently placed the helmet on the small table beside the couch. "Mom, I got you the helmet," he said softly. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at Jake. There was fear in her eyes at first, but when she saw Billy beside her, that fear seemed to melt away. Who are you?" she whispered. Jake took a step forward and spoke gently. "I'm Jake. Your son asked for some help. I'm just here to make sure you're okay." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze shifting from Jake's leather jacket to his Hell's Angels patch. Jake could see the hesitation in her eyes. He was used to that reaction. People often feared what they didn't understand. But then something in her expression changed, and she gave a weak smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake could see the pain in her face. This wasn't just about a helmet or a ride to the hospital. This was a mother who was fighting something far worse than just physical injury. Jake knew this was only the beginning. He could feel it in his gut. Something was terribly wrong here, and it was up to him to figure it out. He glanced at Billy, who was now sitting next to his mother, holding her hand. The boy looked up at Jake with gratitude, but also with the kind of sadness that no child should have to carry. Jake's chest tightened. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was something bigger, something that would force him to face parts of his past he had long tried to forget. But there was no turning back now. He had already made a promise, to protect this family, no matter what it took. The door slammed open behind him, and Jake's instincts kicked in. He spun around, his eyes narrowing. A tall man stood in the doorway, his face hard and angry. Jake recognized him immediately. This was the man Billy had been running from. The man who had been threatening Sarah. The man who was about to make everything much more complicated. The man in the doorway was tall and broad, his arms crossed in a way that made his muscles bulge under the tight black t-shirt. His face was stern, but there was something familiar about him that made Jake's instincts flare. This was no random guy off the street. Jake had seen men like him before, dangerous men with connections and a chip on their shoulder. As the man stepped forward, Billy moved slightly behind Sarah, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice steady, though his body was tense, ready for anything. The man sneered, his eyes scanning Jake's leather jacket and the Hell's Angels patch that marked him as part of a notorious biker gang. "I'm here to collect," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "And I don't take kindly to strangers interfering with my business." Jake knew this was trouble. The man was here for something more than just a helmet. Sarah had been right to be afraid. She wasn't just running from a debt. She was running from something much darker. Jake took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're not taking anything from anyone here," he said firmly, his hands tightening into fists by his sides. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a tense silence, thick with unspoken threats. "You think you can stop me?" the man scoffed, taking a step forward. "I'm not scared of some washed-up biker." Jake's jaw clenched as he looked down at Billy, still clinging to his mother, and then back at the man. He wasn't going to let this go down like this. "I don't want any trouble," Jake said, his voice cold. "But if you hurt anyone in this house, you're going to regret it." The man let out a laugh, a dark, guttural sound that filled the room. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, and with a quick motion, he reached into his jacket. Jake's reflexes kicked in. Before the man could pull out whatever weapon he had hidden, Jake lunged forward, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. The man grunted in pain, but Jake held him firm, his grip like iron. "You're done," Jake growled. "Leave now, before this gets worse for you." The man struggled for a moment, but Jake's hold was unyielding. "You don't know what you're getting into," the man muttered, but he stopped resisting. Jake didn't respond. He just pushed the man towards the door, his feet dragging on the floor as Jake forced him out. With a final shove, Jake slammed the door behind him, locking it with a loud click. He took a deep breath, his heart still racing from the confrontation. Billy and Sarah stood in the living room, staring at him with wide eyes. Sarah's face was pale, but there was a flicker of something else. Relief, maybe. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice softer now. Sarah nodded, though her eyes were still filled with fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Billy looked up at Jake, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved us," he said simply. Jake gave him a small nod, but inside, a storm was brewing. This was far from over. He could feel it in his gut. Whoever that man was, he wouldn't stop. And Jake wasn't going to let anyone threaten his family. Not on his watch. He turned back to Sarah, his mind already racing with what needed to be done next. "You're not safe here," he said, his voice hardening. "We need to get you out of here now." Sarah looked at him, then at Billy, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she nodded. They were going to leave. But where could they go? Who could they trust? Jake didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain. This was just the beginning. And he wasn't going to let them face it alone. As Jake stood in the small living room, the weight of what had just happened pressed down on him. He had successfully sent the man away, but that wasn't the end. The threat still loomed over Sarah and Billy, and Jake knew it. He could feel the tension in the air, the danger that was about to escalate. Jake's mind raced as he thought about the next steps. They couldn't stay here. It was no longer safe. He looked at Sarah, who was standing near the door, her arms wrapped around Billy protectively. She was trying to be strong, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. "We need to move. Now," Jake said, his voice firm. Sarah nodded silently, her face pale as she clutched Billy tighter. Billy looked up at Jake, his small face full of gratitude, but also fear. "Where will we go?" Billy asked, his voice trembling. Jake didn't have a perfect answer. He didn't know where they could go, but he did know one thing. They needed to get out of here before things got worse. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his tone softer than before. He gave Sarah a reassuring glance before he walked towards the window, peering outside. The street was quiet for now, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way. They had to move quickly. "Let's get you packed. We leave in 5 minutes," Jake said, turning back to face them. Sarah nodded and began to gather what little they had. Jake stood guard by the door, his ears straining for any sound outside. His instincts were on high alert. This wasn't just about a threat anymore. It was about survival. The man who had shown up earlier wasn't going to stop. Jake had seen that in his eyes. He would be back, and when he did, it wouldn't just be for Sarah and Billy. It would be for him, too. As Sarah and Billy hurriedly packed, Jake's mind wandered to the past. He had walked away from his old life with the Hells Angels, but that didn't mean his past was behind him. His old enemies were always out there, waiting for him to slip up. And now, it seemed like they had found him again, through Sarah and Billy. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let anyone hurt them. He had made a promise, and Jake never broke his promises. Sarah finished gathering the essentials, and the three of them moved to the back door. Jake glanced once more at the front of the house, making sure no one was waiting outside. The coast was clear for now. As they stepped into the yard, Jake motioned for Sarah and Billy to follow him closely. He led them through the alley, away from the house, trying to keep them out of sight. Every step was calculated, every move deliberate. He had to keep them safe, no matter the cost. They reached the old garage where Jake had parked his bike. "Get on, quick," Jake said, his voice low. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting between Jake and Billy, but then she nodded. She helped Billy onto the back of the bike, and Jake revved the engine, ready to take off. Just as they were about to leave, the sound of a car engine roared to life behind them. Jake's heart dropped. He turned quickly, seeing a black SUV speeding towards them. The man was back. They had been found. Without another word, Jake floored the gas, and the Harley roared to life, shooting down the alley. The night was dark, but Jake's focus was sharp. He had no choice now. It was do or die. Sarah clung tightly to Billy as they sped through the streets, the wind whipping around them. Jake pushed the bike harder, trying to put as much distance between them and the pursuing car. He could hear the engine of the SUV behind them, getting closer, but he wasn't about to let them catch up. Not this time. Not while Sarah and Billy were with him. His heart raced as they rounded a corner, and Jake's mind was set. He wasn't just running away, he was making a stand. The man might have found them, but Jake wasn't going to let him win. The roar of the Harley was deafening, but it didn't drown out the pounding of Jake's heart as he leaned into the curve of the street, the wind howling past him. Sarah clung tightly to Billy, her arms wrapped around him for dear life as they sped through the darkened city. The black SUV was still behind them, the headlights growing brighter as it closed the gap. Jake's mind raced, trying to think of a way to shake the vehicle tailing them. His instincts screamed at him to keep moving, but the relentless pursuit made it feel like there was nowhere to run. "Hold on tight," Jake yelled over his shoulder. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say a word. Billy's face was pressed against her back, his small arms wrapped around her waist. The bike swerved around corners, taking sharp turns at breakneck speeds, but the SUV wasn't far behind. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars, his knuckles white with the strain. He knew they couldn't outrun the SUV forever. The man inside it wasn't going to give up. They had to come up with a plan. Without warning, Jake veered off the main road, cutting through an alleyway. The tires screeched as he navigated through narrow gaps between buildings, but the SUV followed. It was no use. The alleyway wasn't wide enough, and there was no way to escape. Jake's heart sank as he glanced over his shoulder. The SUV was right there, closing in fast. "We need to stop them," Jake muttered to himself. He couldn't let them catch up, not with Sarah and Billy in the line of fire. He looked ahead, spotting a construction site just a few blocks away. There was a long line of steel beams stacked up, and it gave him an idea. "I've got one shot," Jake thought, his mind working quickly. He gunned the engine and shot forward, heading toward the construction site. The SUV followed suit, not knowing Jake's plan. When they reached the site, Jake swerved around a large pile of debris, leading the SUV right into the maze of construction equipment. The SUV's driver slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The truck slid sideways, crashing into a pile of steel beams, blocking the road. Jake didn't slow down. He kept the throttle open, speeding through the site, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind him, he could hear the screeching of metal as the SUV struggled to get free, but it was stuck. For a moment, Jake felt a flicker of relief. They were safe. For now. Jake took a sharp turn and pulled up in front of a small warehouse on the edge of town. He stopped the bike and turned to Sarah. "Get inside. Fast," he said, his voice urgent. Sarah didn't hesitate. She helped Billy off the bike, and the three of them quickly ran into the warehouse. Jake locked the door behind them, his pulse still racing. Inside, the warehouse was dark and quiet, but it offered them a temporary refuge. Sarah and Billy collapsed onto an old couch near the corner of the room. Billy's face was pale, his wide eyes still filled with fear. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "We're safe for now, but it's not over. We need to figure out who that guy is and what he wants with you." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've been running for so long. I thought I was safe here." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. He couldn't let them be dragged into this fight. They had to stay one step ahead. "We're going to lay low for a while," Jake said, his tone firm. "I'll figure out who's behind this, and we'll make sure you and Billy are safe. No one's going to hurt you again." Sarah seemed to take comfort in his words, but there was still a look of fear in her eyes. Jake knew they were in for a long night. The danger wasn't over. But he also knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt them, not as long as he was breathing. The warehouse was quiet, too quiet for Jake's liking. The only sounds were the soft breaths of Sarah and Billy as they huddled together on the couch. Jake stood near the window, peering out into the dark street, his mind racing. The man in the SUV had been too close, and Jake knew they couldn't stay here for long. His instincts told him that their little escape had just bought them time, not safety. He needed to act fast, figure out who was behind this and why they were targeting Sarah. He had a feeling this was more than just a debt. There was something deeper, something that didn't add up. As the minutes ticked by, Jake's frustration grew. He turned away from the window and walked over to Sarah and Billy. Sarah looked up at him, her face still pale but determined. "What now?" she asked quietly. Jake ran a hand through his hair. "We lay low for the night," he said, his voice low but firm. "But first, I need you to tell me everything. I need to know what's going on." Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to Billy, who was quietly resting his head on her shoulder. "I don't know how much I can tell you," she said softly. "I've been running for so long. I thought I was finally safe. But now, everything is falling apart." Jake knelt in front of them, his expression serious. "You're safe now, but I need to know what I'm up against." "Who was that man?" Sarah took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she ran them through her hair. "His name is Victor. He's part of a group that's been trying to track me down for months. They're dangerous, Jake. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Jake's heart sank. The name Victor didn't mean much to him, but the way Sarah said it sent a chill down his spine. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just about money. They were hunting Sarah for something far more valuable. "What do they want with you?" he asked. Sarah looked down, her eyes clouded with fear. I don't know. I didn't ask. I was just trying to survive. But now, they know where I am, and they won't stop until they get what they're looking for. Billy stirred, his voice small and tentative. What do we do now? Jake looked over at the boy, his expression softening. We stay one step ahead. That's all we can do. He turned back to Sarah. I'll find out what they want. But you and Billy are my responsibility now. I'll protect you, no matter what. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, and she nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. I don't know what I would have done without you, Jake. Jake stood up and paced the room, his mind working through their options. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be found. They needed to make a plan, a real one. He needed to get answers about Victor and his group, and he needed to make sure Sarah and Billy were safe. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a faint knock at the warehouse door. Jake froze, his hand instinctively moving to his side, where he kept a small pistol for emergencies. The knock came again, louder this time. Jake signaled for Sarah and Billy to stay quiet, then slowly approached the door, his body tense. He peered through a crack in the door, his heart pounding in his chest. A shadow moved outside, but it wasn't Victor. It was someone else. Someone he didn't recognize. He pulled the door open slightly, just enough to see who it was. Jake? A voice called softly from the darkness. It's me, Murphy. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Murphy. A name from his past, someone he hadn't seen in years. He hadn't expected to see him here, not like this. Jake hesitated for a moment before opening the door fully. Murphy stepped inside, his face grim. You're in trouble, Jake, he said, his voice low. And I think I know who's after you. As Jake stood in the dim light of the warehouse, his mind raced. Murphy's appearance had thrown him off balance. It had been years since he'd seen the old man, and the fact that he was here now meant one thing. Trouble. Murphy had always been a man who knew things that people didn't want to know. And now, it seemed he knew exactly who was after Jake and why. Jake gestured for Murphy to step further into the warehouse, closing the door behind him. He didn't want anyone seeing them. You know who's after me? Jake asked, his voice low but intense. Murphy looked around, scanning the room before his eyes settled on Jake. I know more than you think, and I think it's time you heard the truth. Jake's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't like where this was going, but he needed answers. Go on, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Murphy shifted uncomfortably, his old eyes weary but sharp. It's not just you they're after, Jake. It's the whole damn town. That man, Victor, he's part of a bigger operation, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want. Jake clenched his fists. This wasn't just about Sarah and Billy. This was about something bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. What do they want? Jake asked, his voice growing darker. It's the land, Jake. The land your family used to own. That piece of property you've been sitting on for years. They want it, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it. Jake felt a cold chill run down his spine. His family's land had been sitting idle for years. It wasn't worth much, not to most people. But to Victor and his crew, it was a different story. It was worth everything. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Jake demanded, his eyes narrowing. Murphy took a deep breath. I tried to reach out to you before, but you were too deep into your Hells Angels life. You weren't listening, Jake. You were always running, always looking for trouble. Jake's jaw tightened. He wasn't proud of his past, but it wasn't the time to go down that road. So what now? What do we do? Murphy stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. We fight back, but we have to be smart. They won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way. Jake nodded slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. He wasn't about to let some maniac take his family's land. Not without a fight. He turned back to Sarah and Billy, who had been silently watching from the corner of the room. Billy looked scared, but Sarah looked determined. We'll get through this, Sarah said, her voice steady. You're not alone in this, Jake. We'll fight too. Jake smiled, though the weight of the situation pressed down on him. I'm not letting anything happen to you, or Billy. I'll protect you, no matter what. Murphy let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. You're gonna need more than just your fists, Jake. We're gonna need help. And we're gonna need a plan. Jake turned back to Murphy. What do you have in mind? Murphy looked around the room, his eyes calculating. I know a few people who owe me favors. We'll round them up, get a little backup. But it's gonna be dangerous. You ready for that? Jake's mind raced as he thought of the risks. This wasn't just a street fight. It was war. But he wasn't about to back down now. Not when it was this personal. I'm ready, Jake said, his voice firm. Murphy nodded and gave him a look of approval. Then let's get to work. We don't have much time. Jake looked over at Sarah and Billy. He could see the fear in their eyes, but also a glimmer of hope. They weren't alone anymore. They had a chance. And Jake wasn't going to let that chance slip away. He turned back to Murphy. Let's do this. The following day, Jake gathered his small group of allies. The plan was simple, but that didn't make it easy. Murphy had rounded up a few people from his old contacts, guys who owed him favors, who had been around long enough to know how things worked. They were ready for a fight, but Jake could see the doubt in their eyes. This wasn't going to be an easy win. They were up against a ruthless crew, and Jake wasn't sure if their little band of misfits could take them down. Still, he had no choice. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the abandoned warehouse where they had set up as their base of operations. Jake paced back and forth, his mind running through the details of the plan one last time. They needed to take out Victor's crew before they had a chance to strike back. He had a feeling they were being watched, that someone was tracking their every move. The warehouse door creaked as it opened, and Murphy stepped in, flanked by two men Jake didn't recognize. Both looked like they'd seen their fair share of violence. Muscular, hard-eyed, and silent. This is Hank and Tony, Murphy said, nodding to the men. Jake acknowledged them with a quick glance before turning back to the maps spread out on the table. We'll need to hit them tonight, while they're still vulnerable. Once they regroup, it'll be harder to get close, Jake said, his voice steady. He could hear the tension in his own words. The reality was setting in. This was it. Murphy nodded. I agree. But we need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the more time they have to prepare. Jake looked at Sarah and Billy, who were sitting in the corner. Billy had fallen asleep, his head resting on his mother's lap. Sarah looked exhausted, but she had a fire in her eyes that reminded Jake why he was doing this. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting to protect them. He turned back to the table. We'll split into two groups. Hank and Tony, you two take the east side. Murphy and I will hit the west. We'll surround them. Make sure they don't escape. There was a moment of silence. Before one of the men spoke up. What about the boy? He's too young to be mixed up in all this. Jake turned to face him. Billy is my responsibility. He stays with Sarah. She's going to be safe here while we handle this. The man nodded, but there was a lingering look of concern in his eyes. Jake didn't blame him. It wasn't the safest decision, but it was the right one. He wasn't going to drag Billy into this unless it was absolutely necessary. With the plan in place, the group set out into the night. The air was cool, and the streets were empty. The sounds of the city felt distant, muffled by the urgency of the situation. As they approached the warehouse where Victor and his crew were holed up, Jake's hand tightened around the grip of his gun. They were close. This was it. They didn't have the luxury of making mistakes. Stay low, Jake whispered to Murphy as they moved closer. The tension in the air was palpable, and Jake could feel the weight of it on his shoulders. He was walking into the unknown, and no matter how prepared he was, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking right into a trap. But there was no turning back. Not now. They reached the back of the warehouse, where they could hear the faint sound of voices inside. Jake motioned for the others to take their positions. The plan was to strike hard and fast, surround them, catch them off guard. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he took his place by the door, waiting for the signal. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, Murphy nodded, and Jake pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The dim light from a few scattered bulbs barely illuminated the room, but Jake could see enough. There were at least 5 men inside, all standing around a table, discussing something. Victor was there too, his back to Jake. Without thinking, Jake stepped forward, his boots making no noise on the concrete floor. He raised his gun and aimed it at Victor. It's over, Jake said, his voice cold. The men froze, turning slowly to face him. Victor's eyes locked onto Jake's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The tension in the room was thick, and Jake could almost feel the weight of the moment. Then, Victor smirked. You think you're going to stop me, Jake? He said, his voice mocking. You're already too late. Jake's blood ran cold. He didn't know what Victor meant, but he had a sinking feeling that they had just walked into something far bigger than they had anticipated. Victor's smirk only deepened as he slowly turned around, facing Jake. The dim light from the overhead bulbs barely illuminated his cold, calculating eyes, and Jake could see the twisted satisfaction in them. "You really think you can stop me, don't you?" Victor taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. Jake's grip on the gun tightened, his jaw clenched in response to the mocking tone, but he held his ground. He wasn't about to let Victor's words get to him. Not now, not when everything had led to this moment. "You've already taken too much from people, Victor. You're not going to take anything else," Jake growled, his voice steady. Victor glanced around at his men, who were still frozen in place, clearly unsure of how to react. "You're a fool if you think you can stop this now," Victor continued, his voice lowering, becoming more serious. "This isn't just about land. This is about control. And you've just walked right into a war that's been brewing for a long time." The weight of Victor's words hit Jake like a sledgehammer. He had been right to feel like this was more than just some petty revenge. This was bigger, far bigger. But before Jake could process the implications, Victor's men moved quickly, their guns drawn. They had been waiting for this moment. Without thinking, Jake fired, taking down the closest man to him. The others scrambled, reaching for their weapons, but Jake was faster. The room erupted into chaos. Gunshots rang out, the air thick with tension. Murphy and the other men Jake had brought along were already firing back, covering him. He couldn't afford to think about the bigger picture right now. All that mattered was surviving this confrontation. But through the haze of smoke and the sound of bullets whizzing past him, one thing was clear. Victor wasn't the only threat. There was something far more dangerous lurking behind the scenes. Jake darted behind a metal crate, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to steady his aim. Victor's voice rang out over the chaos. "You think you can kill me and walk away? This is just the beginning, Jake. You're already in over your head." His words echoed in Jake's mind, fueling the growing sense of dread in his gut. As Jake peeked around the crate, he saw Victor retreating, not towards the exit, but deeper into the warehouse. That was when Jake realized the truth. This wasn't just about a fight for land. Victor had plans, big plans, and Jake had just become part of them. Without wasting another moment, Jake sprang into action, following Victor. He moved fast, darting between crates, using the chaos to his advantage. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. Victor had been too confident, too sure of his position. Jake had seen it. Victor wasn't just involved in some local racket. This was part of something far larger, something Jake hadn't even begun to understand. He was about to find out, though. As Jake rounded the corner of the warehouse, he saw Victor standing in front of a large metal door, pressing his hand to a scanner. The door hissed open, revealing a darkened hallway. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Victor called over his shoulder, sensing Jake's approach. "This is bigger than you or your little biker crew. This is the start of a new world order, one that doesn't include people like you." Jake's heart raced as he moved closer, ducking behind a stack of boxes. He had to stop Victor from getting any further into whatever lay beyond that door. But as he prepared to make his move, a sharp, cold voice interrupted him. "You're not getting past me, Jake." A figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking the way. Jake's eyes widened. The last thing he had expected was someone like this, a woman, but not just any woman. This one had the look of someone who had been through the worst and come out stronger for it. Her eyes locked with Jake's, and he could see the cold determination in them. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his voice tense. The woman smiled coldly. "That's not important right now. What matters is that you're about to make a mistake if you keep following him." Jake's instincts told him to run, but something about her made him stay. "Why are you helping him?" Jake asked, trying to make sense of the situation. The woman's smile faded, and she took a step forward. "Because I'm not the one you should be worried about, Jake. It's who's waiting for you when you walk through that door. And trust me, you don't want to face them." Jake's mind reeled as he stared at her. He had been so focused on Victor that he hadn't even considered the people who might be backing him. This fight was just beginning, and Jake wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. The woman's cold smile faded as she stepped closer, her boots making soft thuds against the concrete floor. Jake's eyes narrowed as he sized her up, trying to figure out if she was an ally or just another player in this dangerous game. "I'm not here to stop you," she said quietly, her voice low but sharp. "But if you keep going down this path, you're going to be facing something much worse than Victor. Trust me, you don't want to walk through that door." Jake's mind raced. He had come so far, and now, with Victor so close, he couldn't back down. But the woman's words rang in his head like an alarm bell. He had no idea what he was walking into. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his hands still gripping his gun, ready for anything. The woman didn't flinch. "My name's Rachel," she said simply, "and I'm trying to give you a chance to get out of here before it's too late." Jake's brow furrowed. "Get out of here? You want me to run?" he spat. "I've been running for years. I'm not running anymore." Rachel shook her head slowly. "You don't understand. This isn't just about Victor. He's a pawn in a much bigger game. There are forces at play here that you can't even begin to comprehend." Jake's eyes flashed with anger. "I don't care about your bigger game. I care about protecting Sarah and Billy. That's all that matters right now." Rachel studied him for a moment, her eyes calculating. "And you think you can protect them by charging in blindly?" she asked, her tone a mixture of pity and disbelief. "You're walking into a trap, Jake. The people you're dealing with are far more dangerous than anything you've faced before, and they won't stop until they have what they want." Jake's chest tightened. He didn't like hearing this, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had a bad feeling about this from the start, but now the reality was hitting him like a freight train. His mind flashed back to the confrontation with Victor and his crew. He had barely made it out alive, and now he was walking straight into the lion's den. "Then what do you suggest?" Jake's voice was sharp. "I just give up? Let them win." Rachel's expression softened, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to give up. I'm asking you to think. You're smarter than this. You know this is bigger than just you, than just Sarah and Billy. You need to figure out who's really pulling the strings." Jake clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. "I don't have time for this," he growled. "I've already lost too much. I'm not walking away now." Rachel stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "And I'm not asking you to," she said, her voice steady. "But if you don't stop now and take a step back, you're going to lose more than you can handle. You're going to lose everyone." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jake wanted to argue, to push forward, but something in her voice made him pause. He glanced back toward the door that led deeper into the warehouse, where Victor had disappeared. His instincts told him to charge forward, to take the fight to Victor and his crew, but Rachel's warning echoed in his mind. He was on the edge of something he couldn't control. Taking a deep breath, Jake lowered his gun slightly. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Rachel smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of someone who had seen this all before. "I'm not here to tell you what to do, Jake," she said. "But you need to make sure you're not walking into a trap you can't escape from." She glanced at the door one last time, her gaze hardening. "You have one chance to turn this around. Don't waste it." Jake stood still for a moment, processing her words. Then, with a quick motion, he turned and faced the door once again. "I'm going in," he said firmly. "And I'm not stopping until I take down Victor and anyone else standing in my way." Rachel's eyes flashed with a mixture of concern and understanding. "I can't stop you," she said, her voice low. "But remember, there are consequences. And when you're in too deep, there's no way out." Jake nodded, not looking back. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. He pushed open the door and stepped into the darkness beyond. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air felt different, thick with the tension of what was to come. His senses sharpened, and he moved with purpose, knowing that the battle wasn't over yet. Whatever came next, Jake was ready to face it. He had no other choice. As Jake stepped further into the dark warehouse, the heavy silence enveloped him like a suffocating blanket. The air smelled stale, filled with the metallic scent of rust and oil, but beneath that was something far more dangerous. He could feel it, the weight of eyes on him, as if the darkness itself was watching his every move. He tightened his grip on his gun, the cold metal reassuring in his hand. The adrenaline was surging, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, a feeling that something was wrong. The deeper he moved into the warehouse, the more it felt like a trap closing around him. His steps echoed off the walls, too loud in the silence, as he moved cautiously towards the center of the room. He had no plan anymore. It was just him and the gun, his only means of survival. A flicker of movement in the shadows caught his eye, and he tensed, ready to fire. But it was just a rat, scurrying across the floor. Jake let out a breath, annoyed with himself for being so jumpy. He couldn't afford to be distracted now. He had to focus. He took another step forward, his eyes darting around, scanning every corner of the warehouse. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, the glint of light reflecting off metal. A door, slightly ajar, leading into another part of the warehouse. It was too quiet, too still. Jake moved toward it, keeping his body low, his instincts screaming at him that something was wrong. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and what he saw inside made his blood run cold. The room was dimly lit, filled with crates and large machinery, but it wasn't the room itself that had his attention. It was what was in the center of the room, a large table with several files spread out on it, along with a computer screen that was currently flashing with data. But it wasn't the files or the computer that had Jake frozen in place. It was the man sitting at the table. Victor. Jake's grip on his gun tightened as he stepped further into the room, his eyes never leaving Victor. The man was casually leaning back in his chair, his hands folded behind his head, like he was waiting for Jake to show up. There was no fear in his eyes, only amusement. "You're late," Victor said, his voice smooth and calm, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "I've been expecting you, Jake." Jake's chest tightened as he took another step forward. "I'm done playing games, Victor," he said, his voice hard. "You're going to tell me what this is all about." Victor chuckled, the sound dark and hollow. "You really think you can just walk in here and demand answers?" he asked, shaking his head. "You've already made a lot of mistakes, Jake. This is just the last one." Jake's mind raced, but he didn't let his frustration show. He knew he was walking into the unknown, but he had to push forward. "I'm not leaving here until I know who's behind this and why you're after Sarah and Billy." Victor stood slowly, his hands still behind his head, his expression never changing. "It's bigger than you think," he said, his voice colder now. "You think this is about Sarah? About Billy? You're just a pawn in a much bigger game, Jake. You've already lost." Jake's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't like where this was going. He had always known that there was more to this than just a fight over land, but now it was becoming clearer. He was up against something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "What do you want, Victor?" Jake asked, his voice low and steady. Victor smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the smile of someone who knew something Jake didn't. "You'll find out soon enough," Victor said, his eyes glinting with something Jake couldn't quite place. Before Jake could respond, there was a sharp sound behind him. A door slammed open, and a group of men rushed into the room, weapons drawn. Jake spun around, but it was too late. They were already on him, moving faster than he could react. A shot rang out, the noise deafening, but Jake didn't feel the impact. His mind was too focused on one thing: escape. He had to get out of here. But as the men closed in, Jake realized something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't just about Sarah. It wasn't even about Victor. It was about power, control, and a war that Jake was already too deep in to back out of. And as the men closed in on him, Jake knew that his fight for survival had just begun. The sound of footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as Jake struggled to free himself from the grip of the men surrounding him. His body was pressed hard against the cold floor, his arms restrained by one of the thugs, while another loomed over him with a gun aimed straight at his chest. The sharp scent of gunpowder filled the air, and Jake could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. His mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to go down. He had walked into this warehouse thinking he could confront Victor, put an end to everything. Instead, he was now caught in a deadly trap with no way out. He had no idea who the men were, but he could tell they were all well trained. He could see it in their eyes, the coldness, the precision. They were professionals. The man holding him down sneered, pressing his knee into Jake's back, making it harder for him to breathe. "Thought you could just waltz in here and take control, huh?" the man taunted. Jake's mind screamed for him to fight, to break free. But the moment his body tensed, the man with the gun jabbed the barrel into his ribs, warning him to stay still. "Don't make this harder on yourself," the man with the gun growled. Jake clenched his teeth, fighting against the anger rising inside him. He could feel every muscle in his body screaming to escape, but he had to keep his cool. This wasn't the time for a reckless fight. This was the moment where he needed to outsmart them. As the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, Jake's mind raced, searching for a way out. His eyes darted around, scanning the room. That's when he saw it. Across the room, near the far corner, there was a stack of metal crates, just high enough for him to use for cover. He couldn't fight them all head on, but he could get to the crates, make a break for it. What do you want, Victor? Jake spat, forcing his voice to stay steady. You can't stop me, Jake. No one can. Victor's voice floated from the back of the room, his tone thick with arrogance. Jake didn't need to see Victor to know what he meant. This wasn't just about taking down a few thugs. This was about a larger game, one that Victor had already set in motion. And Jake had unwittingly stepped into the middle of it. You're too late, Victor continued, his voice cold and detached. Everything's already in motion. You're not going to change anything. You'll never stop us. Jake's heart hammered as he realized the truth. Victor wasn't just fighting for power or revenge. He was building something bigger, a network of influence that Jake had no idea how to take down. This wasn't going to be over in a simple fight. This was a war. You think you can run from us? Victor's voice taunted again. You've already made your choice, Jake. You chose the wrong side. But Jake wasn't listening anymore. He had to move, had to find a way out. With all the strength he had left, he twisted his body, breaking free from the grip of the thug holding him. The gunman took a step back in surprise, and that was all Jake needed. He lunged toward the metal crates, diving behind them just as the gunfire erupted behind him. The deafening sound of bullets hitting the concrete wall echoed in his ears as Jake scrambled to his feet. His heart raced as he ducked behind the crates, his body low to the ground. He had to think fast. The men were already moving toward him, but Jake was quick. He could hear their footsteps closing in, their breaths heavy as they searched for him. Without thinking, he grabbed a piece of debris from the floor, anything to use as a weapon, and prepared himself. He had to fight back. This was his only chance. He wasn't about to let Victor win. Not now, not after everything he had been through. The moment the first man stepped around the corner, Jake swung the debris with everything he had, catching the man off guard. He fell to the ground with a grunt, and Jake didn't waste a second. He moved fast, taking the gun from the man's hand and turning it on the others as they came around the corner. The fight wasn't over yet, but Jake wasn't going down without a fight. Not when everything was on the line. Not when Sarah and Billy's lives were still at stake. The gunfire finally ceased, and the warehouse fell into a thick silence, broken only by the sounds of heavy breathing. Jake stood there, chest heaving, his body tense, every muscle ready for the next threat. The men who had been charging toward him now lay scattered on the floor, incapacitated or worse. His mind was a whirl of adrenaline and anger, but there was no time to savor the victory. The fight was far from over. He glanced around the room, his heart pounding in his chest. Where was Victor? The man was too quiet now, too calm. Jake's instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He turned, scanning every corner of the room, his eyes darting from the crates to the shadows in the far reaches of the warehouse. That's when he saw it. The faint light from the corner, where another door stood slightly ajar. Victor's smirk flashed in Jake's memory. You're too late, Victor had said. That meant one thing. Victor had something else planned. With quick steps, Jake moved toward the door, his gun raised, ready for whatever awaited him. As he pushed the door open, a cold, steel-smelling wind hit him. Beyond the door was a narrow hallway, dimly lit by flickering lights overhead. Jake moved cautiously, his footsteps soft against the concrete floor. The air felt different here, still, like a tomb. It was too quiet. Jake pressed on, his senses on high alert. Suddenly, a voice echoed down the hallway, sending a shiver down his spine. You shouldn't have come here, Jake. It was Victor's voice, but it sounded distant, almost distorted. Jake's heart raced. Where are you? He demanded, his voice low but controlled. Right where you belong, Victor replied, his tone calm and cold. Jake's grip tightened around the gun. He wasn't going to let Victor get the best of him again. Not this time. He stepped forward, his boots clicking against the floor, each step echoing louder in the silence. At the end of the hallway, he saw it. A large metal door, identical to the one from earlier, with a keypad beside it. Victor was behind that door. Jake knew it. The sound of rapid footsteps reached his ears as Jake approached the door. Before he could react, the door slammed open. Victor stood there, a wicked smile crossing his face. He had a gun in his hand, but it wasn't aimed at Jake. It was aimed at Sarah and Billy, who were standing behind him, their faces pale with fear. Move, and I'll pull the trigger, Victor warned, his voice icy. Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat. Sarah's face was filled with terror, but she tried to steady herself, keeping her eyes on Jake. Billy stood close to her, holding onto her hand. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't do anything stupid." Jake's eyes never left Victor, his finger lightly resting on the trigger of his own gun. He could feel the weight of the moment. If he made the wrong move, Sarah and Billy could be gone in an instant. "Let them go, Victor," Jake said, his voice low and unwavering. "This is between you and me." Victor chuckled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You think you can take me down, Jake? You think you've won? You're too late." But Jake wasn't listening. He was thinking only of Sarah, of Billy, and of the promises he had made. In that instant, everything clicked. He had come too far, and he wasn't about to lose them now. He took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on Victor's. He could feel the gun in his hand, the weight of it steady and cold, just like his resolve. Without warning, Jake fired. The shot rang out, loud and clear. Victor's hand jerked back, and the gun fell to the floor with a loud clatter. For a moment, everything was still. Then Victor collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a thud. Jake stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind trying to catch up with what had just happened. He had done it. He had stopped Victor. But at what cost? Sarah rushed toward him, pulling Billy along, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You did it," she whispered, her voice shaking. Jake turned to her, his chest tight with emotion. He had kept them safe. He had won. But as he looked at Sarah and Billy, he knew this was just the beginning. There were still enemies out there, still dangers lurking in the shadows. But for now, they were safe. And that was all that mattered. The battle was over. Jake had won, but the war was far from finished. He wasn't just fighting for his survival anymore. He was fighting for them. And he would fight to the end,